Welcome to our May 12th Transportation and Planning Meeting, Part 2. This is sort of a continuation of our Monday meeting where we had 4 items on the agenda that were pretty involved and lengthy. And this one being regarding the Unified Development Ordinance. So we just felt like we really needed to get another meeting in given the importance of this topic. So with that, I'm going to go through introductions real quickly. I think everybody's online. I'm Julie Eiselt, Mayor Pro Tem and Committee Chair.
Larkin Eggleston, Committee Vice Chair.
Braxton Winston, Committee Member.
Malcolm Graham, Committee Member.
Victoria Watlington, Committee Member.
Do we have any council member visitors? Okay, how about staff?
Liz Babson, Charlotte Department of Transportation.
Laura Harmon, Planning Staff.
Alan Goodwin, Planning Staff.
Tim Porter, Urban Forestry, Planning.
Allison Craig, Planning.
Kevin May, Planning.
Yolanda Jones, Planning.
Donata Jackson, Office of Constituent Services.
Lynn Alexander, Charlotte DOT.
Okay, thank you. Do we have a visitor in the back row there? Did I miss?
This is Matt Prosser with Economic Planning Systems.
Oh, great. Thanks, Matt.
Mariah Wozniak, Planning Staff.
Okay. Is that it, or?
David Green with Perkins and Will, Consultant.
Blake Redden, Fire Planning.
Jason Lawrence, Cats. Ed McKinney, CDOT.
Okay, thank you. And I see Mr. Driggs joined us.
Good morning.
Good morning. Okay, with that, we're going to go ahead and just get started. I'm going to turn it over to Allison Craig, our Planning Director, and to get right to the agenda. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem and committee members. I wanted just to say thank you to you all for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to come back and look at this item again this week. It's an important time in the process for the Unified Development Ordinance, and we appreciate the time this morning. So this will be in some ways a continuation of the workshop that we had last week, and we're going to go through some more detailed recommendations that staff has as a result of just staff hearing feedback from the community and the work with our consultants on the economic impact analysis. And we're also going to revisit to the heritage tree discussion. We've gotten the recommendations in a more simplified manner to bring that back before you as requested by the mayor and council members last week. So with that, I will turn it over to Matt and to David to take us through the economic impact analysis update.
Yes, thanks, Allison. Next slide, please. One more. So I'm going to lead us through a few of the large issues or more pressing issues, I guess, that we've identified through the analysis, both my work doing the economic analysis as well as David Green's work with Perkins and Will, who did the design analysis. So I will be presenting, but David will jump in as necessary, as needed, to discuss the design analysis. Just as a reminder, we've worked with the development community through several workshops to try to identify potential issues within the draft UDO that may need modifications or a relook as staff develops the second draft of the UDO. And really, we've been focusing on issues that we felt either impacted the yield or amount of development that could be generated, or impacted the cost of development, and looked at a variety of different issues, both granular and more broad, and try to estimate what those impacts were from a design and economic perspective. So we're going to walk you through the ones that we felt needed some highlighting, and then we'll end with the heritage tree discussion, which will flow into the next presentation. Next slide. So the first one we wanted to highlight is the sidewall height limit. And so for each of these issues, we're kind of walk through what the issue is, what we found from the design perspective and the economic perspective, and then give you a preview of what staff direction is within the next draft. And so for this issue, what was identified is that the draft UDO limits the sidewall height, so the side of the building, the height that it can be at the setback, to 12 feet for duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes in the neighborhood 1 zone districts. The purpose of this, or the intent of this, was to try to transition the buildings from their neighboring units with not having too much of an impact. But what we found from a design perspective is this largely prevents 2-story duplexes or triplexes from being built on lots that were less than 70 feet in width. And so was limiting the potential for these types of units to be built on what are the most prevalent sort of single family lots within the city. And so from an economic perspective, we felt that this sidewall height limit wouldn't prevent development, but would more often lead developers to replacing a small single family home on a lot with a larger one, as opposed to potentially building 2 or 3 units instead, which both limits total value for the parcel, but also would result in higher home prices in the resulting units that were built. And so our direction was to have staff, our recommendation, I should say, not direction. Our recommendation was to have staff reconsider this and potentially raise the minimum at the side setback, and also considers other ways to sort of increase height incrementally from the sidewall setback. In staff's initial direction, and Laura, please feel free to jump in and provide more detail or correct me if I've not correctly representing this, but their initial direction is to modify the draft to allow for 20 feet as the sidewall height at the setback, as opposed to 12. The diagram on the right sort of illustrates the difference between 12 and 18 feet. 18 feet was sort of the minimum that you could do to get to 2 stories. And so wanted to just show that illustration that staff had generated to try to illustrate the issue. Anything to add, David or Laura?
Sounds good.
Yep. All right, next issue. So within the neighborhood 1 zone districts, currently in your ordinances, there's a cluster development alternative for single family development that allows projects to build with smaller lots in exchange for preserving open space. And so the draft approach for this cluster development, what it's called now, the draft approach in the UDO is referred to as the conservation residential development alternative. And this also allows for, it's not exactly the same, but it's similar in that it allows for reduction in lot sizes and lot widths in exchange for greater open space preservation in the neighborhood 1 zone districts. And there's a minimum site requirement of 10 acres to be able to use this alternative. Currently with the cluster development regulation, there's a 2-acre minimum. And so what we found from a design perspective is this cluster development alternative is often used currently by developers to create smaller lots and specifically less wide lots to generate their developments. A lot of the single family areas in the city are zoned R3, which has a minimum of 70-foot width. And the majority of sort of new single family homes being built in the market are being built with lot widths that are smaller than 70 foot, whether they're 50 or 60-foot lots. And so this 10-acre minimum was identified as a barrier to doing those smaller lots and producing more units. We also found that when looking at the development capacity throughout the city, as you know, that the city is largely built out, and a lot of the future development sites that were identified in the city, or at least development parcels, are smaller. We actually found in the neighborhood 1 place type that the average size is 1.4 acres for sites that are either vacant or underutilized and are likely to be redeveloped or infilled. And so we felt that this threshold should be reduced to 2 acres to match with the current practice for the cluster development. And so staff's initial direction is within the draft UDO to reduce the minimum project size to 2 acres from 10. Next slide. So the first two issues we highlight were changes that were identified, or potential issues that were identified that were a change, I think, is being directed. This one is an issue where we don't see a change being made. So this provision relates to residential driveways and parking. And so the draft UDO requires that duplexes, triplexes, and quadruplexes only have one. There's 2 different requirements: 1 driveway access per street frontage. And it also requires that parking, whether a pad or access to a garage, is provided on the side or the rear of a building, as opposed to the front. And the intent of this part of the ordinance is twofold: is to limit the number of curb cut accesses along a street. And so we aren't allowing streets that have multiple curb cuts and access, as well as not having parking in front of all of these units as well, corresponding to those front access areas. This picture on the right illustrates it looks like a triplex that has 3 different access points onto the street frontage for the 3 different garage spaces. And so the intent is to limit that as a way to have the accesses not erode the pedestrian environment and preserve the community character of the neighborhood. So as I said, the UDO requirements limit the number of accesses from on street frontage, and as well as the location of parking. This is only really an issue we've found in the design analysis for interior lots. So lots that have multiple street frontages or an alley, this is not a major issue and can be accommodated. So there are some circumstances where an interior lot would be challenged with trying to provide access to parking on the rear or side of the building. And that can have an impact on the number of units that can be developed. 3 units instead of 4, 4 units instead of 5, that sort of impact. And that is true for sort of smaller projects. When we look at sort of a medium or large size project, over 10 units or so, it's a lot easier to accommodate this access and not lose units. And so it's really just an impact on interior lots and smaller sized projects, whether those are triplexes or quadruplexes. And so we did find, from an economic perspective, there is potential impact on those smaller projects from the loss of units due to design requirements. The recommendation from us was to consider additional flexibility, some additional ideas were provided by development community as well as David Green, and staff's direction at this point is to not change the draft, to make sure that we're maintaining community character. David or Laura, anything to add on this?
I would just say that this only really affects units, projects that are, a very limited number of projects that are from 4 to 8 units. And only the, as Matt said, that are on interior lots. And so it's a very small segment of the townhome or single-family attached development structure.
Thanks, David. Next slide. So this issue relates to, and it's a somewhat complicated issue, and so I'll have David and Laura help me as needed, but I'll do my best to sort of at a high level summarize the issue. And so within the draft UDO, there are requirements for both the provision of open space as well as the preservation of tree areas and or green area. And so sort of some overlapping requirements that we identified that could be a barrier were that most projects have to preserve 10% of their area for open space as well as 15% of the site area for either green area or tree preservation. And as well, there are specifications for the dimensions of the open space that must be set aside. Written today is the minimum of 25 by 25 feet. The design analysis found that these lead to projects, instead of providing green area or open space on site, they more often would likely take advantage of the fee in lieu alternatives instead of providing open space or green area, or providing green areas in areas that are not necessarily ideal or sort of creative solutions. Things like rooftop gardens or other sort of alternatives allowed in the draft UDO, but may not produce the best sort of open space or tree preservation alternatives. Our finding from the economic perspective is the use of fee in lieu decreases or increases development cost. And then the lack of the dimensions of the open space requirements can also reduce potential project yield or the amount of development. And so really the direction from us was, can staff identify ways that these open space and green area requirements can overlap in more situations and circumstances, and so that we are producing open spaces and green areas or tree preservation areas that are more usable and often located in places that are more ideally set for their purpose, and try to limit more the use of the fee in lieu alternative. While the fee in lieu can work and allow the city to provide alternatives in other locations and other parcels, we don't necessarily want that to be the default that the developer usually goes to. And so staff is working on identifying opportunities to overlap the green area and open space requirements, and modifying that minimum dimension for open space areas to make it a little more flexible and less sort of large and prescribed as a way to provide more flexibility for providing open space and green area, but still requiring this enhanced level of preservation in open space and sites, which is desired, as well as part of sort of the character and the built environment described in the comprehensive plan. Next slide. This issue is related to electric vehicle charging stations. So within the draft UDO, a new requirement is for that all multifamily residential components of a mixed-use building, hotels or standalone parking lots over 9 spaces, requiring them to provide up to a certain percentage of spaces that are either EV capable, ready, or installed. So capable defined as spaces that have the wiring and power extended to the spaces, but not necessarily connected or ready to be a charging station. EV ready spaces are ones that are almost fully installed, but are not ready yet for use. And then fully installed are spaces that on day one you can plug an electric vehicle in at that space. And so there's varying amounts of EV capable, ready, and installed, or I should say percentages of those different spaces that are required. And so an example would be for a 50 space parking lot or garage, 10 EV capable spaces have to be required or provided, 5 EV ready spaces provided, and 1 fully installed space needs to be provided. That's a total of 16 spaces out of the 50 units. So as you can see up above, that sort of 32% of spaces need to be either capable, ready, or installed. And so working with the development community, we provided some at least some high level estimates of the increase of cost that would have on sort of a larger or so on a per space basis, it's about $6,000 per space to have it fully installed EV charging. When we look at sort of a larger multifamily building that's typically built in the markets, that's about $2,000 per space that's in the entire parking garage for that building. And we found that was about a 1.3% increase in the cost for that multifamily building. So it is an impactful cost on the development of a multifamily building or other buildings that would have this requirement that would either need to reduce the return for the developer or result in an increase in rental rates that were charged. What we found, at least in the data that we received, was that the most significant cost is related to the materials and the installation to make any space capable at a minimum. And so really the direction was, is it possible for staff to reconsider this requirement to potentially reduce the number of spaces that are required to be ready or capable, and really more focus on trying to get installed or ready spaces as opposed to that higher percentage of EV capable spaces, seeing that really the cost is predominantly borne in just running the wire and the electricity and the conduit to each space to allow it to charge, be an EV charging space. So staff is currently reviewing potential changes that balance the cost concerns as well as trying to meet the goals of the city's strategic energy action plan. And so we felt like this was a good requirement and definitely something that's helping to further those goals, but we're concerned that it might be a little bit too onerous or a little too much of an ask, given the changing nature of technology and charging. And so the staff is currently reviewing that and trying to better match current demand for charging with the requirements, understanding that there may be a need to modify the EDO after adoption as needs increase or decrease depending on technology trends or market trends.
Matt, if I could just jump in for a quick minute on this, a little bit more information on where we're going staff-wise, as we are reducing the number of spaces required for this first UDO so that we'd be eliminating actually the ready spaces. We want to make sure that we can that people can increase the number of spaces, so we're keeping capable and installed. So that should actually, as we looked at this, reduce the cost significantly for developments, but again, maintain things the requirements with where the market is at this point in time, we are also working on a bonus provision for EV so that we can incent providing these spaces by giving a bonus as well.
Great, thank you, Laura. Next
Can I
slide.
ask a question,
Oh, sure, yeah.
Madam Chair? Sorry.
Ms. Winston.
Thank you. So, you know, I like that this is included in the UDO. My biggest concern personally was less about multifamily units and more about single-family homes, and in the future, increased barriers of ownership or ability to live in certain parts of town because the infrastructure is not there or it becomes more expensive as technology becomes more ubiquitous. But I'm wondering if there was any analysis given to correlations of cost between parking minimums, the existence of parking minimums, and costs as it relates to electric vehicle charging stations. And I guess as I'm listening to this, for instance, if we mandate a certain number of parking spots be built and then mandate a certain number of them have to have this upcharge to them, then we're not giving very much wiggle room for the market to kind of determine exactly where that ratio should be. So, you know, would there be the I guess a possibility of the market being able to find an equilibrium if parking minimums weren't there and they could kind of, and these electric vehicle charging stations were to kind of, you know, ameliorate the added costs of both of those regulations stacking on top of each other.
So I guess I'll start, and I think I'll have David weigh in. And so, at least as written, the UDO refers to a percentage of the parking lots or the parking spaces that are planned in a project, and so it's at least correlated to the amount of parking that's required in a project. And then, David, I think if you don't mind, sort of expanding on the approach to parking within the draft UDO and how that relates to the current regulations, and how that might relate to sort of calibrating market demand for parking in projects to the requirements.
I think in the most intense tier 3 of parking, there are no minimums. And so there's a direct correlation between the number of market spaces that are required or desired and the number of EV charging stations. So there's a balance, I think, that you're describing. And then in tier 2, the middle ground, which is the sort of medium density areas, they're lower minimums and then their maximums. And so there's flexibility within that system to allow for response to market conditions. And so in the same way, you can reduce the number of parking spaces, which will be an overall reduction in cost. And then by percent and by actual number, you'll be reducing the number of charging stations. It's an interesting concept that you bring up, though, and I think that there might be an opportunity to offset some minimum parking requirements with an increase in charging stations, I think is what you're getting at, where you spend more money on the electric infrastructure and less on the physical infrastructure, which is more places for more fossil fuel cars. And I would defer to Laura because I think she's looking at some bonus situations here, and I think that might be something that is of interest and might be an interesting, innovative way to address this particular issue.
Thank you, David. Just want to mention that we do, for the EV installed spaces, they count towards 2 of your spaces required under the minimum. So you really are bringing down your minimum requirement where you even have one, which is not in a lot of places, or as many places as currently in our ordinance. But you would be credited 2 parking spaces for every 1 installed EV parking space.
Thank you. And I just I guess the takeaway, I think this is one of those places where we need to be cognizant of double regulations. We might need to prioritize what's more important, parking minimums in certain situations or the future transition of technology in all specifically residential areas I'm concerned about. So, I would be down. Obviously, I'm not an advocate of parking minimums, but I would hope that more of us, even those that are in favor, aren't in favor of double regulating those spaces. Thank you.
I want to just add to Mr. Winston's comments because we had this discussion regarding parking minimums. I personally have a different feeling about parking minimums, that if we're not going to have them, then there's got to be some form of regulation on the streets. So people, either meters or parking permits for residents. So just keeping in, I don't know where that's going to fall in the end, but keeping in mind that that they're all going to impact each other, right? Depending on which way we go with that argument. So that's all I wanted to say about that.
All right, next slide, unless there's additional comments. This potential issue was identified within our sort of employment-oriented focus group.
I'm sorry,
The
Matt.
draft PD.
Hi,
Yes.
Miss Watlington has a question.
Oh,
Okay.
sorry. Yes.
And to the committee, you guys can all text me if you have questions, just because I can't see everybody all at one time. So go ahead, Miss Watlington.
Thank you. My questions are actually, I had some from the other place. I was just capturing them. I didn't know if we were asking in time. So real quick, if you could go back to the sidewalk.
Can I press that just for a second? Because I wondered about that too. I think let's go topic by topic, Matt and Allison, because I know we have a lot. So I think you're right, Ms. Watlington. Otherwise, it gets kind of confusing. So go ahead and let's go backwards to the ones that have already been discussed. So go ahead.
Cool. I just wanted. Oh, okay.
I was wondering if we wanted to get through stop at Heritage Tree so we could get through these next two that Matt has, and then we could pause and hear questions on all of the different topics that were raised. I mean, that's just a suggestion.
Is that okay with you, Ms. Watlington?
Okay.
Yeah, so this issue is related to the minimum or preferred and maximum block lengths for manufacturing and logistics areas. Really, so in distribution and warehouse uses primarily. Currently, the draft UDO specifies a preferred length of 800 feet and a maximum of 1,500 feet. I believe the intent is to limit the sort of length of block for not only sort of the built environment, but also the future reuse potentially of these areas. The analysis found that the preferred and maximal block lengths are sometimes shorter than industrial buildings that are being built today. Actually, we did a review of recently developed projects in Charlotte and found that buildings tended to have a length of 1,000 to 1,700 feet. And so limiting the block length potentially limits the building sizes, which may require more buildings, but also less desirable buildings within the market. And so the direction was to reconsider this block length maximum, and staff is increasing the maximum length to 2,000 feet, and providing an exception when the size of the building cannot be accommodated by the block lengths. And so if there's a certain building being built for a certain purpose or a certain site context that requires a certain size of building, there's some potential exceptions that can be allowed. And this will allow for more of those modern distribution buildings to be built as desired by the market. Next slide. And then the last one before we get into trees. So we'll stop here after I present and have a discussion about all the issues I've talked about. We had a specific group focused on affordable housing. And one of the biggest things that we found was the need and the desire for flexibility in design and zoning standards to support affordable projects. And so currently, the draft UDO allows for some flexibility in which zone district you use in neighborhood one place types. And so a project that's zoned N1A can actually use the N1B standards, which are a little bit more dense or a little more intense. So this provides some greater flexibility, as well as this flexibility in zoning can allow for affordable developers to find parcels that may be a little bit less costly because they're zoned for one potential density, but they're able to use them for a slightly greater density. And so the suggestion from the group and from our analysis, can we expand this idea of flexibility of zone district use to different place types? And specifically, David's analysis found some benefits from flexibility between the neighborhood center and the neighborhood 2 zone districts because of some less urban requirements. So buildings fronting on streets, that sort of thing that provides more flexibility for affordable projects. And these are by and large, 100% affordable, or majority of the units in these projects that we're referring to are affordable units. So mixed income or 100% affordable. And the reflection from the development community that works on these types of projects is that flexibility is often more valuable than even greater density is. And so we've tried to identify a number of different ways that we can be more flexible with the zoning standards for these projects. And so staff is working with that group on additional tools and potential adjustments to the standards if the minimum affordable housing targets are met. So the prescribed amount within the draft UDO is met, then greater flexibility is allowed. And I don't know, Laura, if you want to elaborate on where you guys are headed with that.
We are still working on this. We should have something in literally the next couple of days with respect to specifics, but looking at how we can make sure that we don't lose critical elements of a site, but that we can provide some flexibility and some cost savings for the affordable housing developers.
Yeah, another idea, thanks, Laura. Another idea that we sort of threw out there was, can you potentially waive any sort of fee in lieu requirements as well for these affordable projects? And that's something staff is considering. So with that, those are the issues that we wanted to talk about with you guys today, or you all, I should say, except for the heritage tree issue, which we'll tackle in a minute. So happy to answer any questions, go back to any specific slides and discuss.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Yes, I see Mr. Driggs after Ms. Watlington, but I will check with committee members first. Please go ahead, everybody. Text me if you do have your hand up so that I can see that. Ms. Watlington, go ahead.
Thank you. If you could go back to the sidewall height. Has there been any study done to understand the impact of natural sunlight blockage at the various heights?
I wonder if Laura, if you want to weigh in, or
Sure.
David.
I can.
Yeah, David, if you could, and then I can talk a little bit about our current regulations as well.
Sure, absolutely. So I think that there haven't been any specific studies on the sidewall height, but there are studies that have been done in urban areas, and we can provide those. But the idea here is really that the amount of height that we're increasing isn't going to have a significant impact on the light that you'd be getting from the in between these two houses. But we can, if we need to, we can provide that because it's
Yes, please.
can be a
I'd like
critical
to see
issue
the
at
data.
times.
Thank you. I'd like to see the data on that one. The next one is, as it relates to the moving from 10 acres to 2 acres.
Yeah, the conservation residential development.
So this one here was the reduction of permeable surfaces considered in this one, and what would the impact be?
So this will actually overall reduce the impermeable surface. So what's going to happen is you're going to have a much more compact, efficient development. You're going to actually have more green space overall across the all 10 acres or whatever the size of the development is, down to 2 acres. And that's always the intent of the conservation areas, is to provide more untouched green space.
So that's the part that I'm trying to wrap my mind around, because if I'm somebody that's got an 8-acre site and before I couldn't increase the density, and if we changed it to 2, I could increase the density, correct?
No, it's
But
not
it's not actually
necessarily
increasing the
changing the
density.
density. It's smaller lot sizes and more flexibility in the site design.
But if
And
the
so,
lot sizes are smaller, that means I can have more lots in the same.
yeah, but there's a limit to the amount of development you can do
So,
using that.
but the way that this works is you have the same amount of, you have smaller lot sizes, but you can't build out on the entire 10 or 8-acre site. So there's some portion of it that's part of the conservation program that becomes conserved area. And so if you could build 10 houses on a 10-acre site that's not a conservation, you could build 10 houses also on the conservation easement, but you'd have smaller parcels. And what that allows you to do is gang the houses a little bit closer on that larger area and provide more protected open space. So it's not affecting density in any way whatsoever, but it is positively affecting the amount of permeable surface that would remain on the site after development. And again,
Do you
easy.
have a picture? If you could just provide kind of a before and after what that would actually look like on a lot, that would be helpful.
I was just going to tell you that I'd be happy to provide that.
Thank you.
Sure, no problem.
As far as the single driveway per street frontage, keep feet in. Can you go to that one?
That should be the next slide.
So, okay. So if I'm understanding correctly, right now you're saying that, and I might be having this one on the wrong one. There was one where you talked about, oh no, I'm sorry, not the single driveway street frontage, the one where they're paying fee in lieu instead of the open space and green space.
Yeah, so the next one.
So this one in particular, are we saying that because folks don't want to have to do both, like stack them on top of each other, that they're just paying a fee instead, and in order to not have to have both? Okay, so if that's the case, where is the tipping point? I'm trying to understand how the analysis was done. Like, where do we think that developers then will say, all right, I will actually develop this open/green space if it only takes up 10% of my development versus, hey, thanks for overlapping the two, but you didn't really provide an incentive that's going to change my behavior. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
That does
David,
make
do you want
sense.
to
And I
speak
think
to?
Yeah, there are two issues here. The one is the dimensional issue, and that's important because, especially for smaller sites, if you've got a large open space requirement, especially if it's required to be on the street, it doesn't allow you to build out in a way that we're proposing we'd like to see in the UDO, which is more consistent street walls to get a more beneficial urban effect, for instance. The overlap of open spaces and green space is an interesting situation. And what we found in the analysis is that there's a fairly significant amount of, when they're aggregated, of open space and green space that are required on site. And in many cases, we as the general public might perceive those spaces as the same thing. And so what we're trying to do, working through this process with staff, is say, there might be something where we've got open spaces in a particular area. And one way to think about this is green areas that are amenitized, that have seats and benches or things like that, can count for both open space and green area. And we're trying to find more areas where we're incentivizing developers to create space that's usable, that fits within both of those categories. So instead of having more unusable open space, we have less, better, usable open space.
Understood. What I'm asking is, do we know what the tipping point is where the behavior will change with developers?
It really is. It's an interesting thing, and we can provide you with the analysis for the smaller sites that we did. It's much less of a problem the larger the site is. And so what happens, and so there's no tipping point, it's more like a continuum. And that's why we're trying to sort of think about a way to have more flexibility in this, because 10% of the site is much more difficult to do on a half-acre site than it is on a 10-acre site.
Yeah, that
And
right
the
there,
impact of the half-acre site is
that's
much
the
bigger.
part that I'm trying to get to, is just want to understand, hey, for like you said, a smaller acreage site, this is where we start to see a difference in people just paying the fee in lieu versus. So yeah, if you got that, that'd be great, because I think that'll help us figure out if we have to right size this. Cool.
We do.
Then,
and can I just mention, Ms. Watlington, I really hate to interrupt you because this is all important information, but I think we have to have cameras off at 10 because they need 30 minutes to get ready.
Yeah, that's why I'm trying to hurry.
Okay. I just wanted to make everybody aware of that. So thank you.
Next up, just on the EV charging up to 32%. So is it fine then for somebody to just have 1% of spaces be EV capable?
No, they have to. The up to refers to there's some different ways to different requirements depending on the number of spaces. And so smaller lots have a slightly different requirement than a larger lot. But by and large, it's you have to provide 32% of either capable already. So you can't do less than that.
Got it. Okay. And then my last question is just on the affordable housing piece, and I'm sure we'll see this again. Just a couple of watch outs in terms of affordable housing. And I want to make sure that we are on the same page, or those of us anyway, that we are thinking about this as a council, that the idea in my mind is to get affordable housing in places where there otherwise would not be affordable housing. Because what I see in certain areas where there's already cheaper land, if you will, our affordable housing as it's defined by our AMI is actually above a lot of the market rents in a particular area. For instance, on the west side, affordable housing units oftentimes are more expensive than what you would get just out in the market here, just by basis of naturally occurring affordable housing. So want to make sure that whatever we do here allows us to get more housing in the places we actually want it. I'll say one more time as we talk about incentivizing affordable housing, really hope that we can focus on affordable home ownership. And we'll review the N1A versus N1B just to make sure we understand what we are looking at as it relates to affordable housing in these spaces. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Watlington. Mr. Winston and then Mr. Driggs. And I don't know what we're going to do about heritage trees because I believe we have to sign off in 10 minutes.
One note about open space and green area, again, to the points that were made, I think Parks and Rec policy has a lot to do with this, especially about effective green space that can be utilized for parks and other kind of green areas. I don't know how, but I really think that we need to get them engaged to effectively make policies around this. One question I had was around block lengths. I understand that we need longer block lengths for the type of industrial, especially logistical industrial development that we need and is happening right now. And that in some ways seems to butt up against walkability desires that we have. But I wonder, are there ways, and have we looked at certain kind of design standards on those longer blocks that provide walkability options? While I know that this probably won't be a lot of areas where people live, it'll probably be a lot of areas where people work. So the idea, for instance, of people being able to take transit to these industrial areas and walk to their jobs, are there things like additional crosswalks or signals or things that we can think of with these longer block areas so that those two priorities aren't competing but are some way able to kind of mesh together?
I think that would probably mostly happen, and I'm going to look towards Ed McKinney, who's in the room with us, through the CTR process when you're getting into the additional elements of street design that are beyond the ordinance directly. So we are getting good street design, but how actually additional components are added to the streets would come through the CTR process. And I hope I haven't misspoken.
And understand you probably can't write it into this regulation for one size fits all, but maybe if there's a trigger that you have to go through this menu of items in that CTR process or something like that, I don't know, but maybe we can talk about this offline because I want to make sure everybody gets there. But it's something that maybe we should think about.
Yeah, we're going to have to find a way to have more time available for these kinds of questions. But I'm glad you put it out there. Mr. Driggs?
Yeah, just a brief comment. When we're talking about affordable, there's one thing which is the affordable housing developers and locations that have 50 to 100% affordable. But we have seen in our rezoning process that people come in with petitions that are pretty aggressive on density, and then they offer a 10% or whatever, 15% on Ardrey Kell component of affordable. And the appeal of that is, for one, those are mixed, they're all integrated, and there's no public money involved. So I think we should be more intentional about defining if somebody puts the 10 or 15% affordable component in, what they get for that. It's just an observation, doesn't require a comment now, but.
Okay, and that speaks a little bit, I'll make my comment quick. Because they want 5 more minutes. Well, I'm gonna even save my comment right now because it's just more general with regards to who's making these decisions, ultimately, council or staff. But we can talk about that later. I'm gonna turn it back over to Allison and Laura for our last 5 minutes, 6 minutes.
Thank you. I just thought Laura could briefly summarize the slides at the end, which is content that you have not seen yet. So I'm going to turn it over to Laura.
Laura, if you're talking, we can't hear you.
You can hear me now, right? Sorry about that. I was muted. We are recommending for the UDO that an effective date is 9 months after the adoption of the UDO. We think this will give the development community and the community as a whole to get even more familiar with the UDO, and will also allow staff to prepare all of the supplementary documents and to get ready and to be able to really hit the ground running at that date. Want to let you guys know about what will happen with conventional zoning. Right now, if someone submits in advance of the effective date, they could go ahead and be rezoned. If their decision date is after the effective date, then we would translate those petitions to a new UDO district. We will also, for all of our conventional zoning, it will, through the effective date of the UDO, on the effective date of the UDO, zoning districts will translate to the new UDO zoning districts. That is not true for conditional. Conditional will continue to move forward under the current ordinance, can continue to file for 4 months prior to the UDO effective date, and move forward and be approved under the current regulations. So if you came in for a B1 CD, for example, as long as you were in 4 months prior to the UDO effective date, council could approve you for B1 CD even after the effective date, so that there is, we want to give people adequate time to get their rezonings through. And they would not translate. Conditional rezonings would be looked at a later point through the alignment rezoning process to see which conditionals should change to a new UDO district. A couple of other things to make you all aware of. There are a couple of items with state law. One is something called permit choice. It is established by state law. It says that if an applicant submits a permit application before a text amendment change, in this case before the UDO, and their approval occurs after the UDO goes into effect, then they can choose whether they want to use what we will at some point hopefully be calling the old regulations, or what's currently in place, or the UDO regulations. This doesn't apply to rezonings, but it does apply to development activities. So if you're coming in for a commercial building permit and in the midst of your process, development regulations change, you can decide whether you want to use the old regulations or the new regulations. And one other element that is also established by state law and is very similar is vesting, which says that for conditional rezoning plans, multi-phase development, preliminary subdivision, and development permits, there is a time period that those approvals are good for, and the vested right becomes effective on the day of the approval. And you can see, I won't read it to you, but on the screen, there's a different time period for the vesting. So for conditional rezoning, it is automatically 2 years, and you probably have noticed on a number of conditional plans a request to go up to 5 years. Multi-phase development, which is a larger CD plan, 7 years, preliminary subdivision plans, 3 years, and development permits, 1 year. So just some of the administrative elements of the UDO.
Okay.
That's what I got.
We only have 1 minute left, so what I'm going to say is that I'm going to talk to staff and the mayor about putting a session in place, at least one, where we can ask more of our questions, because I really appreciate you all, Lauren, Allison, and Matt, and everybody giving us these updates as this evolves. But council really does need to have time available to digest this information and have the opportunity to talk about it. So we'll work on trying to get that scheduled sooner than later, because it might even take more than one session, and we'd make that available to the full council. And with that, it's 10 o'clock, so I have a feeling we'll be cut off any second now. But thank you for the time this morning, everybody. I appreciate it, and we'll keep talking.
Thank you.